Black Temple and Mount Hyjal are right around the corner, and some TBC specs are about to become extremely valuable, while others are going to be fighting for a raid spot. And honestly, I think there's a couple of specs that are massively underrated going into Phase 3. Today we're going to be ranking each TBC spec from S tier all the way down to D tier. But there's one really important thing to understand before we start. This isn't purely a DPS tier list. I'm going to be ranking each spec based on their overall performance and raid value, damage, utility, buffs, debuffs, survivability, and how valuable that spec is actually going to be inside of a 25-man raid. Starting in the D tier, we have the Sub Rogue. I don't think anyone's going to be too surprised by this. This is of course a PvP spec more than anything. Really doesn't offer anything in a serious PvE environment. Again, that doesn't mean you can't clear Black Temple as a Sub Rogue. Of course you can, but there are just better options. When you ask the specific question of what class is more optimized for raiding, very obviously a Sub Rogue against a Combat Rogue, you're going to pick the Combat Rogue for progression over a Sub Rogue any day. Next we have the C tier. Gonna have to go with the Frost Mage. This is another spec that simply isn't designed for your go-to PvE scenario of choice. Arcane and Fire are going to perform much better, and we'll get into that a little bit later. If you want to play Frost because you enjoy it, that's completely different. But the real question is, what does my raid leader want me to play in Black Temple? Frost isn't necessarily going to be the answer. Next in the C tier, we have the Marksman Hunter. Hunter is an amazing class in TBC, but BM is so much stronger that it makes the other Hunter specs look worse in comparison. Survival at least provides a valuable raid debuff, but Marksman doesn't really get you the same compelling reason to sacrifice a BM slot. Also in the C tier, we have the Assassination Rogue. Assassination isn't terrible, but again, it's not because the class is unplayable, it's because there are just simply better options. Rogue is already a very popular class and a very low demand when it comes to raiding. Combat is simply going to be the more attractive spec if you're trying to get a raid spot. Moving into B tier, we have the Fire Mage, which I think is going to be perfectly playable, but Arcane is definitely going to still have the spotlight as the better specialization throughout the phase. Once again, if you're trying to optimize your raid, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I bringing a Fire Mage when I can just bring an Arcane Mage? This doesn't mean that Fire is useless, it just means the opportunity cost is higher. For example, your Warlock core could be looking to play Fire this phase, and suddenly that improved Scorch is much more appealing to bring to your raid. Also in the B tier, we have the Disc Priest. Disc is another spec where the exact raid role matters a lot. You can absolutely make a Disc Priest work, and Priest utility is very valuable. I think Disc Priest is super slept on, but in a highly optimized raid, you're simply looking at other Priest specializations instead of Disc. So I'd put it in B. Good? Absolutely. Essential? Not really. Also in the B tier is the Holy Priest, a solid choice for healers. It is definitely the more optimal spec to play for priests, with plenty of useful tools. Yes, it's going to have the highest healing output, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should go in the A tier or even the S tier. They're certainly not a bad choice. I would pick a Holy Priest over a Disc Priest any day of the week. They perform extremely well, and you might be asking, why am I not putting them in the A tier? I think that they just don't offer as much utility compared to some of the other specs you're going to see inside of that A tier. Also in the B tier is going to be the Holy Pally, which remains a very strong healer. The problem is that when you're looking specifically at an optimized group for Phase 3, there are a lot of competing healing options. Holy Pally brings excellent single target healing, strong survivability, and obviously the massive Pally utility. But once you hit those much needed Pally buffs, there's not really a reason to bring a Holy Pally rather than maybe trading them off and bringing 2 Reds. I'm not saying Holy Pally is bad, but compared to the specs I'm putting in the A tier, I think B tier is a more appropriate spot. Also in the B tier is the Demo Warlock. I think this spec gets overshadowed by its 2 siblings, and that's the biggest problem. You're still a Warlock, and that's already a huge advantage compared to some of the other classes. But when your raid can choose between another Destro Warlock and a Demo Warlock, generally speaking, Destro is going to be the more attractive option. Demonology isn't bad, it's just competing against an absolute ridiculous spec. Also in the B tier, we have the Resto Druid, which is a perfectly capable healer. Hots are powerful, they have excellent mobility, and Druids bring excellent utility as well. The problem with the Resto Druid is simply just their competition. You can of course just have your Resto Druid play Dream State to get that improved Fairy Fire, or alternatively just have a Boomkin take that role instead. Additionally, you have a bunch of other strong healers this phase, with Shamans really starting to scale because of all the haste. Paladin's also bringing a little bit more utility and strong single target healing compared to the Resto Druid. And then of course priests filling important healing roles as well. So the Resto Druid really has its work cut out for them. So with that being said, I think Resto Druid absolutely has a raid spot, it's just not one of those specs you're absolutely desperate to stack. Lastly in the B tier, we have the Balanced Druid, one of those specs that doesn't necessarily blow you away on the damage meter. but the utility you get is absolutely massive. Improved Fairy Fire, like we talked about earlier, provides valuable hit support, and of course the usual Druid toolkit with Rebirth and Innervate. So you're likely not stacking Boomkins, but having one can provide a lot of value to the right caster-heavy group. Now we're getting into the really interesting specs, but even some of these A tier specs are going to be really hard to compete with what I'm putting into the S tier. Moving into the A tier, I'm going to have to go with the Prot Warrior. Still a very good tank and arguably one of the tanks that gets the most hate. The problem is that Phase 3 is where the Prot Pally really starts to shine on those AoE heavy encounters. With that being said, this doesn't mean that the Prot Warrior is bad, it's just simply outshined by the other tanks. They still bring excellent single target tanking, some of the best defensive cooldowns in the game, and this might be a hot take, but for progression, I think they're the go-to tank for Illidan or any fight where the boss is dual wielding. Also joining the Prot Warrior in the A tier is going to be the Affliction Warlock. They're obviously not going to compete with the Destro Warlock in terms of raw DPS, but they can put out some pretty solid numbers given the right group. They provide valuable caster utility through their debuff Curse of Elements, and of course they're going to be specced into Malediction, making that Curse of Elements even better. Because Warlock is already such a powerful class in TBC, even the less optimal Warlock spec still has a place. You generally want to stack Destro Warlocks first, but having an Affliction Warlock in the right composition absolutely makes sense. Next in the A tier is the Feral Druid. Feral is one of the most valuable flex specs in TBC. You can bring a Feral that contributes meaningful damage while also giving you that access to having another tank. Leader of the Pack remains especially valuable to those physical groups, and with the ability to fill different roles depending on the encounter, makes Feral incredibly flexible. Feral Druids also bring another AoE taunt with Challenging Roar. This is a really huge bit of utility if you set up a Bop AoE taunt rotation. This can help smoothen out trash packs that could potentially lead to a wipe. The biggest reason it's not in the S tier is generally you're looking to have a specific number of Ferals, probably no more than 2 in your raids, so you're not necessarily trying to stack them. Also in the A tier is the underrated Ellie Shaman. I think Ellie Shaman gets a lot of hate since they don't scale very well, but that Totem of Wrath is very powerful as a caster support piece. Their personal DPS compared to the Destro Warlock or the Arcane Mage is not incredible, but that utility is the reason you bring them to your raids. Alongside that, the additional haste they're going to get in tier 6 is going to make them a little bit better than they are right now. Just like previous phases, you're not going to be bringing the Shaman just for their personal DPS. You're bringing them because of how much raid DPS you gain by putting them in your groups. This is probably where a lot of people are going to disagree with me, but Shadow Priest is going to be in the A tier. A Shadow Priest brings incredible utility through that mana support for casters and healer groups. This is a classic example where the spec is always going to be better to bring rather than just looking at the DPS meter. Just like some of the other classes, you probably don't want 5 Shadow Priests, but having 1 Shadow Priest in your raid, absolutely. Also in the A tier is going to be the Survival Hunter. Survival isn't going to compete with the BM Hunter in terms of raw damage. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But the one thing that they provide, which is extremely valuable to the entire raid, is that Exposed Weakness debuff. This makes the spec a powerful support option. While I wouldn't replace every single BM Hunter with Survival, having 1 Survival Hunter can make a lot of sense in an optimized raid. Also in the A tier, we have the Arms Warrior. They're a perfect example of why this isn't a DPS tier list. If you're looking at raw damage, you might want to put Arms a lot lower. But with the spec bringing Blood Frenzy, this increases physical damage taken by the target. And with a lot of classes scaling in Phase 3, especially with all that much needed armor pen, Arms Warrior is a much more appealing pick. This next pick is going to shock a lot of people, but I'm putting the Combat Rogue in A tier. I think their damage is excellent in Phase 3. They of course bring Exposed Weakness, which is really nice for your physical groups. They of course are going to have to fight the warriors for those Warglaives, but if they get Warglaives, they're going to easily be in that top 5 position in terms of DPS. Rogues don't bring the same raid-wide utility like a Shaman or Warlock does, so that's naturally something they're going to have to compete with. That said, Distract is a really underrated bit of utility. In Mount Hyjal, you could use it to stall incoming bosses or trash waves if your raid isn't quite ready, buying everyone a little extra time to get set up. It's super niche, but when you need it, it's actually pretty useful. If you ever wiped on a boss fight in Mount Hyjal, you know just how demoralizing that can be. Having to reset and clear that entire trash wave all over again is definitely not how you want to spend your raid night. And then on top of that, nothing has changed. The big problem here is that melee spots are very competitive, so of course, the Combat Rogue maybe doesn't seem so appealing, but I think the Combat Rogue absolutely deserves to be here. Also in the A tier is the Arcane Mage, probably one of the easiest picks to put in the A tier. Their damage is great, especially with the right utility and raid support. The main reason I'm not putting the Mage in the S tier is simply because they don't bring the same level of raid utility like the Shaman or Warlock does. On top of that, the haste gear that's going to be acquired in this phase mages are not going to really be able to utilize it. Early on in Phase 3, you absolutely want at least 1 or 2 arcane mages, but as we approach ZA and even Sunwell, you're going to start to dial it back as the mage definitely starts to get outscaled by the Destro Warlocks. Lastly, in the A tier, we have probably one of the most fun classes to play, at least in my opinion, and that's the Ret Pally. Another spec where you're not necessarily bringing them for their DPS, but I think they kind of pop off in tier 6. You of course get the Pally utility package with freedom, blessing of protection, all that good stuff, and of course the Pally buffs. And like I said, they're a melee DPS that actually contributes to some pretty meaningful damage in Phase 3. Unlike some of the specs that are lower on this list, Ret provides enough utility and damage to justify their spot in their raid. And like I said earlier, I think you're gonna be bringing 2 Rets. You're not necessarily stacking them like most of the other specs, but I think that's kind of become the meta to bringing 2 Ret Pallys in 1 prot. Now for the S tier, we get one of those specs that is here primarily because of its damage, and it's just too overwhelming to look at. It's the Fury Warrior. They scale incredibly well, especially if they get Warglaives. This spec becomes just an absolute monster. The only real downside here is that a lot of people want to play them, so it's a very hard raid spot to get. And compared to the ranged DPS that have it a lot easier, you are a melee DPS, so you're going to have to deal with a lot of the other mechanics. Warriors also bring another AoE taunt to the raid with Challenging Shout. Just like the Feral Druids, this is a very useful bit of utility if you set up a bop AoE taunt rotation. But when it comes down to a warrior doing their job, and that's just doing DPS, they do it extremely well, especially on overall. Joining them in the S tier is the Protection Paladin. If you're building an optimized raid, the Prot Pelly is the easiest pick by far. Especially during Mount Hyjal trash, if you don't have a Prot Pelly, it's an absolute nightmare. Their ability to handle a large amount of mobs with AoE threat makes the Prot Pelly a no-brainer. And in Hyjal, it gives them plenty of opportunities to show exactly why this spec is so good. They're not necessarily the tank you want doing everything, but when it comes to trash or any AoE encounter, they are phenomenal. And on top of that, they get even more threat generation, being able to use Exorcism with a lot of the encounters being demons or undead. Next in the S tier, we have the Resto Shaman. Honestly, I can make an argument for every Shaman specialization being really high on this list, but specifically Resto Shamans are going to start to outperform every other healer. With all the haste gear they're going to get in Phase 3, Chain Heal is going to absolutely start to crank. On top of that, Resto gives the much needed Bloodlust, Mana Tides are also great, and of course those powerful totems bringing strong raid utility. So on top of bringing strong utility, the healing output from a Resto Shaman is going to really start to scale. You're really going to start to notice their overall throughput in Phase 3. In my opinion, this will make them incredibly difficult to replace. Next, we have another Shaman spec in the S tier. What a surprise. It's the Enhanced Shaman. They're by far the most in-demand class in TBC. For whatever reason, a lot of people don't play them. I think the main reason is a good Enhanced Shaman is kind of hard to come by nowadays. They're just so squishy on trash, you really have to respect the mechanics, and a lot of players just simply don't do that. If you're coming from playing a Pally or even a Warrior, they really don't have to respect the mechanics as much as an Enhanced does. Sometimes on trash, an Enhanced Shaman is just going to get one shot. Enhanced Shamans are just the complete package for a melee support. Unleash Rage, Wind Fury, all the other totems, they just bring so much to the raid. Next up, we have the BM Hunter, another spec that is basically built for TBC. The personal damage is excellent. Since their pet contributes to a large amount of their overall damage, as long as their pet stays alive, they're gonna be doing some really good DPS. The Hunter, of course, brings incredible utility with Misdirection and Feign Death. On top of that, Ferocious Inspiration gives the raid another reason to stack multiple BM Hunters. They have a simple but complex rotation if you are to get into melee weaving, which is very rewarding to play. And this is one of the specs where the answer isn't, should we bring a BM Hunter? It's more like, how many can we fit in our raid? Finally, we have the Destruction Warlock, one of the best classes in TBC, and they really start to shine in Phase 3. If you're playing a Warlock, Phase 3 is looking really good for you. Destro is one of the strongest caster DPS specs in the game, scaling incredibly well with gear and raid buffs, and Warlocks just have a ton of advantages in these raids. Unlike some of the other high DPS specs, you don't really need a complicated reason to justify bringing more. They're just extremely good. You can get away with stacking multiple Destro Warlocks, and that's why they're just so valuable in an optimized raid. Wrapping things up, the Warlock has a very simple playstyle, making them very easy to perform on, and mark my words, by the end of Phase 3, they are going to be the kings on overall damage. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Comment down below what you think I should change around, and as always, I'll see you next time.